Godly mothers may be the most powerful force on the face of this earth. They, even more than their husbands, are responsible for raising up godly children. And it is godly children who become godly adults that change the church, that change the country, that change the world. A young man grew up in the back country of Illinois, and he went on to become the President of the United States at a time when this great democratic experiment looked like a complete failure. But Abraham Lincoln was used by God to end slavery and bring back together brothers and sisters under one nation, one constitution, one government. And I often wonder, where would this country be today if God had not used Abraham Lincoln in the White House during that Civil War period? Where would the world be today without the United States that we now know? And where did Abraham Lincoln draw his strength from in those dark days in the White House? Here's what he said. I remembered my mother's prayers and how they've always followed me. They have clung to me all my life. This morning we want to look at the power of a praying mother. But in order for you to understand the significance of Hannah's prayer, I want you to see the context behind that prayer. For the next several weeks, we're going to begin studying the book of 1 Samuel. Now, the book of 1 Samuel is a very important book in the Old Testament because it marks a significant transition in the history of Israel. Israel, upon entering the Promised Land, lived as a group of basically unaffiliated tribes, and for 350 years, they were governed by the judges. Now, this time of the judges was a godless and wicked period in Israel's history. They were constantly fighting off Moabites, Midianites, and Philistines. They worshiped other gods, and in fact, there are many instances of Israelites sacrificing their children to foreign gods during this period. It was a dark day in Israel. And as we come to the end of the Judges, we even find Israel in the middle of a civil war. The tribes of Israel are warring against the tribe of Benjamin. And the only way that that civil war ends is through further immorality. And then we come to the very last sentence in the book of Judges, and it defines what's happening now in 1 Samuel. In the very last sentence of the book of Judges, we read this. In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Now this political, moral, and military morass is really the setting now that we find ourselves in the book of 1 Samuel. In fact, if we were to look at the book of 1 Samuel and compare it to our own American experience, it would be very similar to our Revolutionary War period. If you think about it, during the Revolutionary War, the colonies existed as separate states. They had very little to do with each other on a formal basis. But during the Revolutionary War, they came together and formed one cohesive country with one centralized government, with standardized laws, and they even appointed a president. Now that experience, that American experience, very closely resembles what happened in the book of 1 Samuel. In the book of 1 Samuel, Israel transitions from this godless period under the judges to a time of renewal and somewhat revival under a ruling monarchy. And it's so fitting that we start the study of 1 Samuel on Mother's Day. Now, I'll grant you, the picture I've just painted doesn't seem like a fitting background for Mother's Day, but rest assured it is. Because out of this godless period that we know as the time of the judges, God raised up a force that was so powerful that it changed the direction of the nation of Israel. And in fact, it was a continuing force in God's redemptive plan. God raised up out of all of this wickedness, not a soldier to fight Israel's battles, Not a king to organize its government, but a mother, a praying mother to lead revival and renewal in Israel. When God wanted to change the course of Israel, when God wanted to preserve his people of the promise, when God wanted to call his people out of idolatry and back to himself, he did so through a praying mother. God's instrument of change in this critical period in Israel's history was Hannah, the mother of Samuel, the last great judge and prophet of Israel. And as we study her prayer this morning, I think the Holy Spirit will show us the power of a praying woman, the power of a praying mother. Now, there's several things I want you to see in her prayer, but first, notice that Hannah's prayer had a godly priority. Look at verse 9. Once when they had finished eating and drinking in Shiloh, Hannah stood up. Now Eli the priest was sitting on a chair by the doorpost of the Lord's temple. In bitterness of soul, Hannah wept much and prayed to the Lord. And she made a vow, saying, O Lord Almighty, if you will only look upon your servant's misery and remember me, do not forget your servant, but give her a son. Then I will give him to the Lord for all the days of his life, and no razor will ever touch his head. Hannah is weeping and praying for God's blessing in her life. Now, most parents today will say that their children are, at least most of the time, a blessing from God. But in this cultural period of Israel, children were the significant indicator of God's blessing on the life of a woman. If a woman did not have children, culturally it was deemed that God's blessing was not upon her. And Hannah wants God's blessing in her life. It's easy to understand how people thought of that, why people thought that children were God's blessing. Because in that society, children were critical to the existence of a family. You think of these farmers, they had very small plots of land. If they were shepherds or herders, they had very few animals. And they needed free labor in order to be financially viable. That came from children. Not only that, but parents in those days had no 401k. So they had no financial viability when they were too old to work. They depended on their children to take care of them. So it's easy to see that's why people thought that children were a blessing from God. But that's not why Hannah wanted children. That's not why Hannah wanted children. She simply wanted to see the blessing of God in her life. She understood some of these Old Testament passages. Psalm 127:3. Sons are a heritage from the Lord. Children are a reward from him. Psalm 128. Your wife will be like a fruitful vine within your house. Your sons will be like olive shoots around your table. But how do we know that Hannah only wanted the blessings of God in her life and not all the financial benefits that children brought? Because from the very beginning, Hannah offered her child back to God. In the beginning, from the very beginning, she offered to give him back to the Lord. She was willing to give up the free labor that this would have brought. She was willing to give up the free retirement plan. She wanted to give her child to the Lord in order to receive God's blessing. Hannah's prayer had a godly priority. Next, notice that Hannah's prayer had a godly purpose. Hannah prayed for her child before he was even born. She prayed that he would be a godly man. She prayed that he would be a Nazirite. Now, a Nazirite was a person who lived under certain personal restrictions in order to openly declare that they were dedicating themselves to God. In Numbers 6, we read that, for example, a Nazirite would never cut his hair. A Nazirite would never drink or eat anything that was affiliated with grapes. So no grape juice, no eating fresh grapes, no wine. A Nazirite would never go near a dead body. So if, for example, a loved one died while you were in this Nazirite vow, you wouldn't even go to the funeral. You are setting yourself apart publicly, dedicating yourself to God. Now, a Nazirite vow, interestingly enough, was only for a set period of time. Was only for a set period of time. For example, a young man may say, I'm going off to college, and I want to have God's blessing on my college, and I want him to guide me in the decision process, and therefore I might dedicate myself to this Nazirite vow. I might take on this vow and refrain from these things, which a Nazirite would, in order to receive God's guidance during this time. But after 4 years, when I'm graduated from college and he's shown me what job I should take, then I release myself from this vow. So a Nazirite vow is only for a set period of time. But that's not what Hannah prayed for her children. Look at verse 11. And she made a vow saying, O Lord Almighty, if you will only look upon your servant's misery and remember me and not forget your servant, but give her a son, then I will give him to the Lord for all the days of his life, and no razor will ever be used on his head. Hannah's desire for her son was that he be dedicated to God for all the days of his life. Hannah didn't want to raise a good child. She wanted to raise a godly child. Hannah didn't want to raise a moral child. She wanted to raise a child that was dedicated to God for his entire life. What a prayer for your child. What a prayer for your child. How many of us pray that way for our children? More often than not, we pray, Lord, help my son or daughter to make friends in this new school. Lord, it would really be good if they could get on this sports team. Please help them get on this sports team. Lord, help them to do well in college and get a good job. Now, those are not bad prayers. But all of that is missing in the prayer of Hannah. She cuts right to the heart of the matter and she says, Lord, it's my prayer that my child serve you all the days of his life. She went right to what was most important. She understood 3 John verse 4. I have no greater joy than to hear that my children are walking in the truth. Hannah's prayer had a godly purpose. Next, notice that Hannah's prayer had a godly persistence. Look at verse 10. In the bitterness of soul, Hannah wept much and prayed. And then verse 12, as she kept on praying to the Lord, Eli observed her mouth. Hannah was praying in her heart, and her lips were not moving, but her voice was not heard. Hannah poured out her heart with great persistence. In spite of the ridicule of a rival, in spite of a husband who tried to talk her out of it, in spite of the accusations of a foolish priest, Hannah continued to pray to God. She pleaded with God for a child, and she covered him in prayer her entire life, I'm sure. His entire life, I'm sure. And that's a powerful lesson for those of us parents, especially whose children are not walking with the Lord right now. Powerful, persistent prayer is effective. It absolutely is effective. Sometimes it takes years of praying to bring a loved one back to the Lord. Sometimes it takes a lifetime. St. Augustine's mother prayed for him for 17 years before he recommitted his life to God. We must always, always remember that persistent prayer is powerful prayer. No matter how dark, how difficult, how desolate the situation, we must keep on praying. Psalm 27:14 says this, wait on the Lord, be strong, take heart, and wait on the Lord. Ephesians 6:18, pray in the Spirit on all occasions with all kinds of prayers and requests. With this in mind, be alert and always keep on praying. Hannah's prayer had a godly